The morning mist clung to the towering glass facade of Blackwood Tower like a shroud of secrets, and as Charlotte Hayes pressed her palm against the cold marble of the reception desk, she could not have foreseen that this day would mark the beginning of a transformation so profound it would shake the very foundations of her carefully constructed existence. The receptionist, a woman whose smile bore the mechanical precision of one accustomed to delivering rehearsed pleasantries, regarded Charlotte with the particular brand of polite skepticism reserved for those who dared to believe they might succeed where 23 others had failed. "Miss Hayes," the woman said, her voice carrying the crisp efficiency of expensive education, "I must warn you that Mr. Blackwood is particular about his domestic arrangements. The children require someone with exceptional fortitude." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Charlotte felt something stir within her, not fear, as the woman clearly expected, but a curious mixture of determination and recognition, as if she had been preparing for this moment without knowing it. The elevator that carried her to the 32nd floor moved with the silent precision of wealth, and Charlotte found herself studying her reflection in its polished walls. At 28, she possessed a face that spoke of quiet strength rather than conventional beauty, angular cheekbones that caught the light with interesting shadows, eyes of such deep brown they appeared almost black in certain illumination, and hair that refused to conform to fashionable styles, instead falling in waves that seemed to move with a will of their own. She had dressed carefully for this interview, choosing a navy dress that suggested competence without ostentation. But now she wondered if competence would be sufficient for whatever awaited her behind the mahogany doors of Alexander Blackwood's domain. The penthouse office that greeted her spoke of power, exercised with surgical precision, floor-to-ceiling windows that commanded the city like a conquered territory, furniture that whispered of Italian craftsmanship and unlimited resources, and everywhere the subtle markers of a man who had bent the world to his will through sheer force of intellect and determination. Yet it was not the opulence that arrested her attention, but the man who stood silhouetted against those commanding windows, his profile etched with the sharp angles of someone who had learned early that vulnerability was a luxury he could not afford. Alexander Blackwood turned as she entered, and Charlotte felt the full force of his attention like a physical weight. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 35, with the kind of dark hair that suggested he ran impatient fingers through it when deep in thought, and eyes of such pale grey they seemed to see through pretense to the truth beneath. His suit was perfectly tailored, yet there was something in his posture that spoke of weariness, as if the armor of his success had grown heavy with the weight of expectations. "Miss Hayes," he said, and his voice carried the particular cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I trust Mrs. Pemberton has informed you of the challenges inherent in this position." He gestured toward a chair positioned precisely to catch the morning light, and Charlotte recognized the subtle psychology of power. She would be illuminated while he remained in shadow, examined like a specimen under glass. "She mentioned that previous candidates had found the role demanding," Charlotte replied, settling into the chair with a composure that she hoped disguised the rapid beating of her heart. "I am not easily discouraged by demanding circumstances, Mr. Blackwood." A ghost of something, amusement perhaps or recognition, flickered across his features before disappearing behind the mask of professional assessment. 23 nannies, Miss Hayes. 23 highly qualified, extensively vetted professionals, each convinced they possessed the necessary skills to manage my children. The longest tenure was 6 days. The shortest, he paused, and Charlotte caught a glimpse of something that might have been pain before he continued, 47 minutes. "Perhaps," Charlotte said, surprising herself with her boldness, "they approached the situation with the wrong expectations." "And what expectations would you bring to this position?" The question carried the weight of genuine curiosity, and Charlotte felt herself being evaluated by an intelligence that missed nothing. She considered her words carefully, aware that her answer might determine not only her employment, but the course of her immediate future. "I would expect to encounter children who have learned that adults are temporary fixtures in their lives, Mr. Blackwood. Children who have perhaps discovered that driving away those who attempt to care for them is preferable to the disappointment of inevitable abandonment." The silence that followed her words seemed to expand and contract like a living thing, and Charlotte watched as Alexander Blackwood's carefully maintained composure shifted almost imperceptibly. He moved away from the window, coming to rest behind his desk with the measured precision of someone who used physical space as a tool of control. "You speak as though you have experience with such situations," he observed, and Charlotte detected something new in his tone, not the clinical assessment of an employer, but the careful probing of someone who recognized a kindred spirit in unexpected places. "I was raised in circumstances that taught me the value of resilience, Mr. Blackwood, both in developing it and recognizing it in others." Charlotte met his gaze steadily, aware that she was revealing more than she had intended, yet sensing that anything less than honesty would be both detected and dismissed. "The children are 8 years old," he said, settling into his chair with the fluid grace of someone comfortable with command. "Twins, Sophia and Sebastian, they have been without consistent maternal influence since their mother's death 3 years ago." The words were delivered with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to discuss painful subjects without betraying emotion. Yet Charlotte heard the weight of grief and guilt that colored his tone. "I see," she said simply, recognizing that expressions of sympathy would be unwelcome and likely counterproductive. "They attend St. Bartholomew's Academy during the day, when they are not suspended for various infractions. Your primary responsibilities would involve after-school supervision, homework assistance, and general behavioral management." He spoke as though describing a business transaction, yet Charlotte sensed the careful way he avoided her eyes when discussing his children's disciplinary issues. "What sort of infractions?" she asked, and was rewarded by a look of something that might have been respect. "Creative ones," he replied dryly. "Sebastian once convinced his entire class that the school was haunted by staging elaborate paranormal phenomena during lunch period. Sophia has a talent for restructuring the social hierarchies of her peer group through what the administration terms psychological manipulation." Despite herself, Charlotte felt her lips curve in the faintest suggestion of a smile. "They sound formidable. That is one word for them." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her with renewed interest. "Tell me about your qualifications, Miss Hayes. Your resume indicates experience in education, but no specific childcare credentials." "I taught literature at Pembroke Academy for 4 years, Charlotte replied, aware that her employment history might seem inadequate for the task at hand. "Before that, I worked with at-risk youth through various community programs. I find that children who have been labeled as difficult often simply require someone willing to understand the logic behind their behavior." "And why did you leave teaching?" The question struck deeper than she had anticipated, and Charlotte found herself navigating the delicate balance between honesty and discretion. "I discovered that institutional settings often prevent the kind of individual attention that troubled children require. I began to feel that I could be more effective working with smaller groups or individual cases, such as 2 exceptionally challenging 8-year-olds whose father has exhausted the patience of every reputable childcare agency in the city." "Precisely." Charlotte met his gaze without flinching and was surprised to see something that looked almost like relief in his expression. Alexander rose from his chair with the fluid motion of barely contained energy, moving to the window where the morning sun had finally burned through the mist to reveal the city in sharp, unforgiving detail. "The salary is $60,000 annually, with full benefits and accommodation in the penthouse guest suite. Your schedule would be 3 to 8 on weekdays, with occasional weekend responsibilities when I travel for business." He spoke without turning, his voice carrying the detached tone of someone reciting familiar terms. The position requires absolute discretion regarding family matters and the ability to adapt to unconventional situations. Unconventional in what sense? Charlotte asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. My children, Miss Hayes, have developed certain strategies for maintaining control over their environment. Previous nannies have encountered everything from elaborate practical jokes to psychological warfare. They are exceptionally intelligent and utterly ruthless when they perceive a threat to their carefully constructed independence. He turned back to face her, and Charlotte saw something in his expression that went beyond professional concern, a father's helpless love for children he could not reach. I see, Charlotte said, and found that she genuinely did. They have learned to protect themselves by ensuring that no one can disappoint them. Precisely. The word carried a weight of recognition and weary admiration. The question, Miss Hayes, is whether you possess the particular combination of patience, intelligence, and sheer stubborn determination required to outlast their defenses. Charlotte considered the challenge laid before her. Two brilliant, wounded children who had weaponized their pain into a fortress against adult intrusion, and a father whose love for them was evident in every careful word he spoke. She thought of her own childhood, of the lessons learned in surviving circumstances that would have broken weaker spirits, and felt a familiar stirring of purpose. When would you like me to start? She asked. The transformation in Alexander Blackwood's expression was subtle but unmistakable. Surprise gave way to something that might have been hope before being carefully suppressed behind professional reserve. You haven't met them yet, he pointed out. Would meeting them change your assessment of their needs? Charlotte asked in return, and was rewarded by the first genuine smile she had seen from him. No, he admitted, but it might change yours. I doubt that very much, Mr. Blackwood. He studied her for a long moment, and Charlotte had the sense of being evaluated by criteria she could not fathom. Finally, he reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a key card, which he extended toward her with the solemnity of a ritual. The children will be home from school at 3:30, he said. Mrs. Pemberton will show you to your quarters and provide you with the household guidelines. I should warn you, Miss Hayes, they will test you. Not today, perhaps, but soon. They will probe for weaknesses, exploit any hesitation, and attempt to discover the precise pressure point that will send you fleeing like all the others. Charlotte accepted the keycard, feeling its weight like a talisman of possibility. And when they do, Mr. Blackwood, they will discover that some people cannot be so easily dismissed. The confidence in her voice seemed to surprise them both, and for a moment, the careful distance between employer and employee dissolved into something more immediate. Two adults who recognized in each other the particular strength born of surviving what should have been insurmountable circumstances. I hope you are right, Miss Hayes, Alexander said quietly. For their sake, I truly hope you are right. As Charlotte made her way back through the gleaming corridors of Blackwood Tower, she found herself considering not the challenges that awaited her, but the unexpected glimpse she had caught of vulnerability in Alexander Blackwood's carefully guarded expression. Here was a man who wielded power like a sword, who commanded empires and bent corporations to his will, yet who stood helpless before the defense mechanisms of two wounded children. The irony was not lost on her. In his professional life, he was renowned for solving the unsolvable, yet in his personal realm, he had encountered the one problem that could not be conquered through force of will or application of resources. The penthouse guest suite that would serve as her accommodation exceeded anything Charlotte had experienced in her 28 years. A spacious bedroom with windows that framed the city like a living painting, a sitting area appointed with furniture that whispered of understated luxury, and a bathroom that could have graced the pages of architectural magazines. Yet it was not the opulence that caught her attention, but the careful emptiness of the space. No personal touches, no suggestion that anyone had ever truly inhabited these rooms. It seemed to her a metaphor for the entire family she had agreed to serve. Beautiful, expensive, and profoundly isolated. Mrs. Pemberton, who had overseen the domestic arrangements with the efficient precision of someone accustomed to maintaining order in chaos, provided Charlotte with a folder containing the children's schedules, dietary restrictions, and what she termed behavioral patterns. The clinical language of the documents could not disguise what Charlotte recognized as a catalogue of pain. Two children who had learned to express their grief and abandonment through increasingly elaborate acts of rebellion. "The children have been informed of your arrival," Mrs. Pemberton said, her tone carefully neutral. "I should warn you, Miss Hayes, that they have developed certain traditions regarding new staff members." "What sort of traditions?" Charlotte asked, though she suspected the answer would be illuminating rather than reassuring. "Last month, they convinced their previous nanny that the penthouse was infested with rare South American insects by creating an elaborate display of exotic specimens they had ordered online. The month before that, they staged what appeared to be a poltergeist haunting using sophisticated audio equipment and carefully orchestrated furniture movement." Mrs. Pemberton's expression suggested grudging admiration for the children's creativity, even as she disapproved of their methods. Charlotte found herself genuinely intrigued by the complexity of the schemes described. These were not the random acts of childish rebellion, but carefully orchestrated campaigns designed to achieve specific psychological effects. Such sophistication in 8-year-olds suggested not only exceptional intelligence, but also a deep understanding of adult psychology and an advanced capacity for strategic planning. "How do they coordinate these efforts?" she asked. "Do they typically work together, or does one take the lead?" "They function as a unit," Mrs. Pemberton replied, and Charlotte detected a note of something that might have been respect in her tone. "Sophia tends towards psychological manipulation. She can read people with uncanny accuracy and knows precisely which emotional buttons to press. Sebastian is more technically minded. He handles the mechanical and electronic aspects of their schemes. Together, they form a formidable partnership." As 3:30 approached, Charlotte positioned herself in the main living area of the penthouse, which commanded a view of the elevator banks through floor-to-ceiling glass panels. She had chosen her location carefully, visible enough to be noticed immediately, yet not so prominent as to suggest anxiety or aggression. The space around her was a study in sophisticated minimalism, all clean lines and neutral tones that spoke of professional interior design rather than personal preference. It struck her as a stage set for a life never actually lived, and she wondered if the children felt as displaced in their own home as she did in this moment. The elevator chimed with the soft precision of expensive engineering, and Charlotte felt her pulse quicken with anticipation and something she refused to acknowledge as apprehension. The doors slid open with whispered efficiency, revealing two small figures who stood with the poise of seasoned generals surveying a battlefield. Sophia Blackwood possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that photographers spent fortunes attempting to capture. Silvery blonde hair that fell in perfect waves to her shoulders, eyes of the same pale grey as her father's, and features that would have been merely pretty on any other child, but achieved something approaching otherworldly perfection on her small face. Yet it was not her beauty that arrested Charlotte's attention, but the intelligence that burned in those distinctive eyes, an awareness far too sophisticated for her 8 years, tempered by something that looked suspiciously like calculation. Sebastian stood beside his twin with the casual confidence of someone comfortable with his place in any hierarchy, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that suggested deliberate carelessness rather than natural disorder. Where his sister possessed ethereal beauty, he radiated a different kind of magnetism, the charismatic appeal of someone who could convince others to follow him into any adventure, no matter how inadvisable. His eyes, darker than his sister's but equally intelligent, studied Charlotte with the focused intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. For a long moment, The three of them regarded each other in silence, and Charlotte had the distinct impression that she was being evaluated according to criteria she could not hope to understand. The children's assessment felt less like the natural curiosity of youth meeting a new adult authority figure, and more like the careful calculation of experienced strategists determining the most effective approach to a new opponent. "You must be Charlotte," Sophia said finally, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone who had learned early that words were weapons to be wielded with surgical precision. "We've been so looking forward to meeting you." The sweetness of her tone might have deceived someone less experienced in reading beneath surface presentations, but Charlotte heard the subtle edge that suggested anything but innocent anticipation. This was a child who had learned to use her appearance and apparent vulnerability as tools for manipulation, and Charlotte felt a familiar stirring of recognition. She had encountered such strategic thinking before in herself, during the long years when survival had required the ability to read adult intentions and respond accordingly. "It's a pleasure to meet you both," Charlotte replied, keeping her own tone carefully neutral. "I hope we'll work well together." Sebastian's laugh carried a note of genuine amusement rather than childish mischief, and Charlotte realized that her careful neutrality had been noted and appreciated rather than dismissed. "She's different," he said to his sister, as though Charlotte were not present. "The last one started crying before we even spoke to her. The one before that tried to hug us immediately," Sophia added, her tone suggesting that such behavior had been not only unwelcome, but actively offensive. "She kept calling us darling and sweetheart in this terrible voice, like she was talking to puppies." "How awful for you," Charlotte said, and meant it. She had always found adult attempts to manufacture instant intimacy with children both presumptuous and counterproductive. "I imagine that felt quite condescending." The twins exchanged a look that spoke of rapid communication through channels developed over years of partnership, and Charlotte saw something shift in their assessment of her. It was subtle, a slight relaxation in Sophia's carefully maintained posture, a fractional decrease in the intensity of Sebastian's scrutiny, but unmistakable to someone trained in reading such signals. "Most adults don't understand that we prefer honesty," Sophia observed, settling onto the pristine white sofa with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to being observed. "They think we need to be managed." "In my experience," Charlotte replied, choosing her own seat with deliberate care, "children generally respond better to being treated as the intelligent individuals they are, rather than as problems requiring management." "Even children who have driven away 23 nannies in 18 months, Sebastian asked, and Charlotte heard the challenge beneath the apparently casual question. "Especially those children," she replied without hesitation. "Such consistency in results suggests a clear purpose behind the behavior. I find purpose infinitely more interesting than compliance." The silence that followed her words felt charged with possibility, and Charlotte had the sense that she had passed some crucial preliminary test. The children continued to study her with that unnerving intelligence, but the quality of their attention had shifted from assessment to something approaching curiosity. "What did Father tell you about us?" Sophia asked, and Charlotte caught the careful way she avoided more intimate terminology. "That you are exceptionally intelligent, creative in your problem-solving approaches, and protective of your independence," Charlotte replied honestly. "He also mentioned that you have little patience for adults who underestimate your capabilities." "Did he tell you about the others?" Sebastian's question carried a weight of significance that suggested the fate of previous nannies was a matter of particular importance to the children. "He mentioned that previous arrangements had been unsuccessful," Charlotte said carefully, "but he didn't provide details about specific incidents." The twins exchanged another of their rapid, wordless consultations, and Charlotte sensed that her diplomatic response had been the correct one. These children had no desire to be defined by their past victories over inadequate opponents. They wanted to be engaged on their own terms, in the present moment. "We have homework," Sophia announced, rising from the sofa with the decisive movement of someone accustomed to controlling conversations through strategic withdrawal. "We typically work in Sebastian's room because it has the better computer setup." "That sounds like an excellent arrangement," Charlotte replied, making no move to follow them. "Would you prefer to work independently, or would you find it helpful to have someone available for questions?" The surprise on both children's faces was quickly suppressed, but Charlotte had caught it. They had expected demands for supervision, insistence on involvement, or at minimum questions about their academic progress. Her apparent willingness to grant them autonomy was clearly unexpected. "We might have questions," Sebastian said after a moment, his tone carefully casual. "About literature. That's what you taught before, wasn't it?" "It was," Charlotte confirmed. "I'm quite fond of stories that explore complex characters and moral ambiguity. I find them much more interesting than tales with simple heroes and obvious villains." Sophia's smile was the first genuinely unguarded expression Charlotte had seen from either child, and it transformed her face from merely beautiful to something approaching radiant. "We like stories like that too," she said. "Most adults prefer the simple ones." "Most adults are afraid of complexity," Charlotte replied. "They find it easier to believe in clear categories, good and evil, right and wrong, heroes and villains. But real life is rarely so accommodating." The children disappeared into the depths of the penthouse, leaving Charlotte alone with the spectacular view and the growing certainty that she had embarked upon something far more complex than a simple employment arrangement. These were not typical 8-year-olds, nor were their behavioral issues the result of mere childish rebellion. They were casualties of circumstances beyond their control, who had developed sophisticated defense mechanisms to protect themselves from further disappointment and abandonment. As the afternoon light shifted across the pristine surfaces of the living space, Charlotte found herself thinking not of the challenges ahead, but of the unexpected recognition she had seen in Alexander Blackwood's eyes that morning. Here was a family bound together by love and separated by walls of their own construction. A father whose success in every other arena of life had left him helpless before the needs of his own children, and two brilliant young people who had learned that emotional safety lay in maintaining control over every variable in their environment. The task she had accepted extended far beyond the duties outlined in any employment contract. She would need to prove herself worthy of trust to 3 individuals who had learned, through painful experience, that trust was a luxury they could not afford. Yet as she sat in that beautiful empty room, watching the city pulse with life beyond the windows, Charlotte felt something she had not experienced in years. A sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival, a recognition that she had finally found the place where her particular combination of strengths and experiences might serve a purpose greater than herself. The sound of voices from the direction of the children's rooms, animated discussion rather than mere compliance, suggested that her initial assessment had been correct. Sophia and Sebastian Blackwood were not problems to be solved, but individuals to be understood, respected, and gradually convinced that not all adults were temporary fixtures in their carefully constructed world. The real test, Charlotte knew, would come not today, but in the days and weeks ahead, when the children's initial curiosity gave way to more systematic attempts to define the boundaries of their new relationship. They would probe for weaknesses, test her resolve, and attempt to discover whether she, like all the others, could be driven away through strategic application of their considerable intelligence and creativity. But as the afternoon deepened into evening, and the sounds of homework and companionship drifted through the penthouse like a promise of possibility, Charlotte found herself looking forward to those challenges with something approaching anticipation. For the first time in longer than she cared to remember, she was exactly where she belonged. The first test came, as Charlotte had anticipated, on her 3rd day in the Blackwood household, delivered with the precision of a surgical strike and the creativity that marked all of the twins' collaborative efforts. She discovered it upon returning from her morning walk through the meticulously maintained gardens that surrounded Blackwood Tower. a habit she had developed to clear her mind before the children's return from school. The elevator doors opened to reveal a scene of such artfully arranged chaos that she paused for a moment in genuine admiration of the theatrical skill involved. The pristine white furniture of the main living area had been draped with what appeared to be aged canvas, creating an atmosphere of decay and abandonment that transformed the sophisticated space into something resembling a haunted mansion from Gothic literature. Cobwebs, clearly artificial but convincingly aged, stretched between the crystal chandeliers, and the hardwood floors were scattered with what looked like centuries of accumulated dust and debris. The windows had been covered with a translucent material that filtered the afternoon light into an appropriately sepulchral gloom, and somewhere in the shadows, a sound system played barely audible whispers and sighs that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. Charlotte set down her purse with deliberate care and moved deeper into the transformed space, noting the meticulous attention to detail that had gone into the creation. This was not the hasty prank of impulsive children, but a carefully orchestrated production that spoke of hours of planning and preparation. She could see where furniture had been precisely positioned to create sightlines and shadow effects, where hidden speakers had been strategically placed to optimize the acoustic experience, and where lighting had been manipulated to achieve maximum atmospheric impact. "Remarkable," she said aloud, her voice carrying clearly through the artificial twilight. "The attention to period detail is particularly impressive. Whoever researched this clearly has a sophisticated understanding of Gothic aesthetics." A barely perceptible rustle from behind the transformed sofa suggested that her audience was closer than they had intended to reveal, and Charlotte felt a familiar warmth of recognition. These children were not content with mere disruption. They were artists of psychological manipulation, craftspeople whose medium was human emotion and whose canvas was the controlled environment of their home. "The acoustic design is especially clever," she continued, settling into what had once been an elegant armchair and was now draped to resemble something from a Victorian morning parlour. "The whispers seem to come from everywhere and nowhere. It creates a genuine sense of unease without relying on obviously artificial effects." The whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Charlotte could hear the barely perceptible hum of the building's ventilation system. She waited, understanding that this pause represented a crucial moment in the children's evaluation of her response. Previous nannies had likely fled immediately, or demanded the immediate restoration of order, or attempted to locate and confront the architects of this transformation. Charlotte chose instead to demonstrate appreciation for their artistry, while making it clear that she was neither frightened nor offended by their efforts. "I particularly admire the commitment to atmosphere," she observed, examining what appeared to be a carefully aged family portrait that had been substituted for one of Alexander Blackwood's corporate achievements. It would have been easy to rely on obvious effects, fake blood, jumping mechanisms, loud noises, but this is far more sophisticated. It works on a psychological level rather than merely startling the observer. Sebastian emerged first, rising from behind a strategically positioned ottoman with the fluid motion of someone comfortable with dramatic revelation. His dark hair was artfully disheveled, and his school uniform had been modified with what appeared to be theatrical makeup to suggest Victorian mourning attire. The effect was both convincing and oddly charming, an 8-year-old's interpretation of Gothic melancholy that managed to be simultaneously precocious and endearing. "You're not scared," he observed, and Charlotte heard both disappointment and curiosity in his tone. "Should I be?" Charlotte asked in return. "I'm certainly impressed. This represents a considerable investment of time and creative energy, but fear seems an inappropriate response to such evident artistic skill." Sophia appeared from behind the transformed bookshelf with the graceful emergence of a stage actress making her entrance, her silvery hair crowned with what appeared to be a circlet of artificial roses that had been aged to suggest decades of decay. Her school dress had been similarly modified, and she carried herself with the regal bearing of someone playing a role she had studied extensively. "Most adults become upset when we redecorate," she said, her tone carefully neutral despite the obvious disappointment in her expression. "I imagine they do," Charlotte replied, "but most adults probably fail to recognize the considerable talent required to achieve effects like these. This isn't vandalism, it's environmental theater of a very high caliber." The twins exchanged one of their rapid, wordless consultations, and Charlotte sensed that her response had disrupted their carefully planned scenario. They had expected fear, anger, demands for explanation, or attempts to restore immediate order. Her appreciation for their creativity had clearly not been among the anticipated reactions, and they were now navigating uncharted territory in their relationship with adult authority. "We spent all morning on it," Sebastian admitted, and Charlotte heard the pride he was attempting to suppress. "Sophia designed the overall concept, and I handled the technical implementation. The whisper track is actually a compilation of recordings from famous haunted locations that I modified and layered for optimal psychological impact. The visual elements are based on authentic Victorian mourning practices," Sophia added, settling onto the draped sofa with the fluid grace of someone comfortable with performance. "I researched historical photographs and period literature to ensure accuracy in the details." Charlotte felt a familiar stirring of recognition as she listened to the children describe their project. Here was the same passion for research and attention to detail that she had once brought to her own academic pursuits, channeled into an elaborate form of psychological experimentation. These children were not merely acting out. They were conducting sophisticated investigations into human behavior, using their home as a laboratory, and the adults in their lives as unwitting subjects. "Have you documented the responses of previous subjects?" she asked, and was rewarded by the surprise that flickered across both children's faces. "Subjects?" Sophia repeated, and Charlotte heard the careful interest in her tone. "The other nannies," Charlotte clarified. "If you're conducting systematic experiments in environmental psychology, I assume you've been recording the results for analysis." Sebastian's grin was the first completely unguarded expression Charlotte had seen from him, transforming his face from merely handsome to genuinely beautiful. "We keep detailed notes," he admitted. "Response times, emotional reactions, specific behaviors, it's all documented." "Could I see them?" Charlotte asked. "I find experimental methodology fascinating, particularly when applied to psychological research." The silence that followed her request felt charged with possibility and risk in equal measure. Charlotte understood that she was asking to see not merely the records of childish pranks, but a comprehensive catalogue of adult weaknesses and failures, as observed and documented by two exceptionally intelligent children. Such information would represent not only their scientific curiosity, but also their accumulated defense against the disappointment inherent in trusting adults who inevitably proved inadequate to their needs. "Why would you want to see them?" Sophia asked, and Charlotte heard the genuine confusion beneath the careful neutrality of her tone. "Because I suspect they represent a sophisticated understanding of human psychology," Charlotte replied honestly. "And because I believe they might help me understand what you've learned about the adults who have attempted to care for you." The twins looked at each other with that rapid communication that spoke of years of partnership, and Charlotte saw something shift in their assessment of her. She was no longer simply another adult to be managed and eventually dismissed, but something more complex. Someone who recognized the intelligence behind their actions and was genuinely interested in their observations and conclusions. "The documentation is in Sebastian's room," Sophia said finally, "along with the technical equipment and research materials." "Would you be willing to show me?" Charlotte asked. "I promise to treat your work with the respect it deserves." The tour that followed provided Charlotte with insights into the children's world that no amount of clinical observation could have revealed. Sebastian's room was part bedroom, part laboratory and part command center. Sophisticated electronic equipment shared space with textbooks on psychology and behavioral analysis, while carefully organized files contained not only the promised documentation, but also detailed floor plans of the penthouse, photographs of previous nannies, and what appeared to be comprehensive psychological profiles of each failed caregiver. "We started keeping records after the fifth one," Sebastian explained, pulling a leather-bound notebook from a locked drawer with the solemnity of someone revealing sacred texts. "Initially, it was just for entertainment, but we began to notice patterns in the responses." Charlotte accepted the notebook with appropriate reverence, understanding that she was being granted access to something far more significant than mere documentation. This was the accumulated wisdom of two children who had learned to survive by understanding and predicting adult behavior with scientific precision. The entries were detailed, insightful, and often devastatingly accurate in their assessment of each caregiver's psychological vulnerabilities. "Miss Patterson lasted 4 days," she read aloud from one entry. "Initial presentation suggested confidence and experience, but closer observation revealed deep insecurity regarding her professional competence. Responded to challenges to her authority with increasing rigidity and eventual emotional breakdown. Primary weakness, need for immediate respect and obedience. Recommended approach for elimination, systematic undermining of perceived expertise. She cried when we questioned her interpretation of our homework assignment," Sophia added, from her position on Sebastian's bed, where she had arranged herself with the casual elegance of someone comfortable in any environment. "We weren't even being difficult. We genuinely wanted to understand her reasoning, but she took it as a personal attack on her qualifications." Charlotte continued reading, finding herself simultaneously impressed by the children's analytical skills and saddened by the evidence of so many failed attempts at connection. Each entry revealed not only the inadequacies of the adults involved, but also the children's growing sophistication in identifying and exploiting those weaknesses. They had become experts in human psychology out of necessity, developing defensive strategies that protected them from disappointment while ensuring their continued autonomy. "What about me?" she asked, closing the notebook and meeting Sebastian's curious gaze. "Have you started my file yet?" "We've made preliminary observations," Sophia admitted, and Charlotte heard the careful neutrality that suggested significant internal debate about how much to reveal. "But you're different from the others." "Different how?" "You don't seem afraid of us," Sebastian said, settling into his desk chair with the fluid motion of someone comfortable discussing complex subjects. "Most adults are either intimidated by our intelligence or dismissive of it. They either try to control us through authority or manipulate us through false affection. You just accept us as we are. You also haven't tried to change anything," Sophia added. "Usually by the 3rd day, they're attempting to implement new rules, restructure our routines, or impose their own ideas about appropriate childhood behavior." Charlotte considered their observations, recognizing the accuracy of their assessment while understanding the deeper significance of their words. These children had learned to recognize the subtle signs of adult discomfort with their unconventional intelligence and had developed sophisticated defenses against attempts to normalize or control them. Her apparent acceptance of their autonomy was clearly unexpected and potentially disorienting to their established patterns of interaction. "I haven't seen any evidence that changes are necessary," Charlotte replied honestly. "You seem quite capable of managing your own affairs, and your academic performance suggests that your current routines are effective." "Father doesn't think so," Sebastian said, and Charlotte caught the careful way he monitored her response to this revelation. "He thinks we need structure, guidance, normal childhood experiences." "And what do you think?" Charlotte asked. The question seemed to surprise both children, and Charlotte realized that they were rarely asked for their opinions about their own needs and circumstances. Previous caregivers had likely arrived with predetermined ideas about appropriate childhood development, and had attempted to impose those concepts without consultation or consideration of the children's own perspectives. "I think," Sophia said slowly, as though testing unfamiliar territory, "that we've already experienced more than most children our age. Not necessarily better or worse experiences, but certainly different ones. Trying to pretend otherwise seems dishonest and impractical," Sebastian added. "We can't unknow what we know or unfeel what we've felt. Attempting to create artificial childhood experiences just highlights the gap between what we are and what adults think we should be." Charlotte felt a familiar tightness in her chest as she listened to the children articulate their understanding of their situation with such clarity and resignation. Here were two 8-year-olds who had been forced to develop adult perspectives on loss, abandonment, and the failure of institutions designed to protect them. Their intelligence had become both shield and sword, protecting them from further hurt while ensuring their continued isolation from the conventional childhood experiences their father believed they needed. "Your father loves you very much," she said quietly, understanding that this observation might be unwelcome, but feeling compelled to acknowledge what she had seen in Alexander Blackwood's carefully guarded expression. "We know," Sophia replied, and Charlotte heard both affection and frustration in her tone. "But he doesn't understand us. He sees problems where we see solutions, chaos where we see organization, rebellion where we see self-protection. He wants to fix us," Sebastian added with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "But we're not broken, we're adapted." The accuracy of their assessment was both impressive and heartbreaking, and Charlotte found herself grappling with the complex dynamics of a family bound together by love, but separated by fundamentally different perspectives on survival and success. Alexander Blackwood's desire to provide his children with normal, happy childhoods was both admirable and impossible. They had already moved beyond the possibility of conventional innocence into territory that required different kinds of strength and different definitions of well-being. "What would you want him to understand about you?" Charlotte asked, and saw both children consider the question with the seriousness it deserved. "That we're not trying to be difficult," Sophia said finally. "We're trying to be safe, and that sometimes being safe means maintaining control over our environment, even when that control makes adults uncomfortable. And that we don't need to be fixed," Sebastian added. "We need to be seen, understood, accepted for who we actually are, rather than who adults think we should be." Charlotte felt something settle into place in her understanding as she listened to the children articulate their needs with such clarity and precision. Here was the real challenge of her position, not managing behavioral problems or imposing structure, but serving as a bridge between two generations who loved each other deeply but spoke fundamentally different languages of emotional survival. "Would you be willing to help me understand your father's perspective as well?" she asked, and saw both children's expressions shift with surprise and curiosity. "What do you mean?" Sophia asked. "I mean that just as your behavior serves important purposes that adults often fail to recognize, his concerns and desires probably serve important purposes that you might not fully appreciate. Understanding works both ways." The silence that followed her suggestion felt different from the careful pauses that had characterized their earlier interactions. This was the silence of genuine consideration rather than strategic evaluation. Charlotte could see both children wrestling with the novel concept that their father's apparently irrational desires for their normalization might spring from needs and fears as valid as their own requirements for safety and control. "He's afraid," Sebastian said suddenly, as though the realization had struck him with unexpected force. "Not of us, but for us." He wants us to have what he didn't," Sophia added, her tone suggesting she was working through the implications of this understanding in real time. "Security, innocence, protection from adult responsibilities." "But we can't," Sebastian continued, and Charlotte heard the gentle sadness that colored his words. We can't unknow what we know about death and abandonment and the ways adults fail the children they're supposed to protect. Charlotte felt her heart tighten as she watched these exceptionally mature children grapple with the tragic impossibility of their father's hopes for them. They understood with painful clarity that Alexander Blackwood's desire to give them conventional childhoods was both an expression of profound love and an impossible dream. They had already moved beyond the boundaries of innocence into territory that required different kinds of wisdom and different definitions of happiness. "No," she agreed quietly, "you can't. But perhaps you can find ways to help him understand that wisdom and experience don't necessarily preclude happiness or security. They simply require different forms of both." The late afternoon light was beginning to fade beyond Sebastian's windows, casting long shadows across his carefully organized domain, and Charlotte realized that hours had passed since the children's return from school. They had spent the entire afternoon in conversation, not the artificial interaction of adult supervision and childhood compliance, but the genuine exchange of ideas between individuals who recognized and respected each other's intelligence and perspective. "We should probably restore the living room," Sophia said eventually, though her tone suggested reluctance rather than eagerness to end their discussion. "Mrs. Pemberton will be arriving soon to prepare dinner, and she doesn't approve of our artistic expressions. Would you like help?" Charlotte offered, understanding that her participation in the restoration process would represent another level of acceptance and complicity in their activities. "You don't mind helping us clean up our mess?" Sebastian asked, and Charlotte heard the careful way he tested her response to being asked to participate in the consequences of their actions. "It's not a mess," Charlotte replied, rising from her chair with the fluid motion of someone who had found her footing in unfamiliar terrain. "It's the conclusion of a successful experiment. And yes, I'd be happy to help document the results and prepare for the next phase of your research." The restoration process that followed provided Charlotte with additional insights into the children's collaborative dynamic and organizational skills. They had clearly planned not only the creation of their Gothic tableau, but also its efficient dismantling, with each element designed for rapid removal and storage. Their movements were coordinated with the precision of a well-rehearsed performance, and Charlotte found herself impressed once again by their ability to function as a unified entity while maintaining their individual strengths and perspectives. "Where do you store all of this?" she asked, helping Sebastian carefully coil the sound cables that had created the whisper effects. "There's a storage room connected to the utility areas that Father doesn't use," Sophia explained, folding the aged canvas draping with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Pemberton knows about it, but she pretends she doesn't. I think she actually enjoys our projects, even though she has to maintain professional disapproval." E.d. As they worked, Charlotte found herself thinking about the complex web of relationships that surrounded the children. Not just their father's frustrated love and her own developing understanding, but also the household staff who had learned to navigate the space between professional responsibility and genuine affection for two exceptional children whose needs defied conventional categories. By the time Mrs. Pemberton arrived with her usual efficient punctuality, the living room had been restored to its pristine minimalism, with no evidence remaining of the afternoon's Gothic transformation. Charlotte watched as the older woman surveyed the space with apparent satisfaction, noting the subtle way her gaze lingered on certain areas where she had clearly expected to find evidence of creative disruption. "I trust the afternoon has been productive," Mrs. Pemberton said, her tone carefully neutral, but her eyes twinkling with what looked suspiciously like suppressed amusement. "Very much so," Charlotte replied, meeting the housekeeper's knowing gaze with her own carefully composed expression. "The children have been showing me their research projects. Quite impressive work." "Indeed," Mrs. Pemberton agreed, and Charlotte caught the subtle approval in her tone. "Master Sebastian and Miss Sophia are remarkably gifted researchers. Their attention to detail is exceptional, As Mrs. Pemberton bustled away to attend to dinner preparations, Charlotte found herself reflecting on the unexpected developments of the afternoon. She had arrived expecting to face the first of many tests designed to probe her weaknesses and exploit her vulnerabilities. Instead, she had been granted access to the children's inner world, their documentation, their perspectives, and their surprisingly mature understanding of the complex dynamics that governed their family relationships. More significantly, she had begun to understand that her role in this household would extend far beyond the traditional boundaries of childcare or even education. These children needed neither management nor correction. They needed an adult who could appreciate their intelligence while helping them navigate the emotional complexity of their unusual circumstances. They needed someone who could serve as interpreter between their sophisticated understanding of survival and their father's desperate desire to protect them from the very experiences that had shaped their remarkable resilience. As the children retreated to their respective rooms to change from their school uniforms and prepare for dinner, Charlotte positioned herself once again in the main living area, watching the city lights begin to twinkle beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The space that had been transformed into a Gothic theatre just hours earlier now appeared exactly as it had that morning, elegant, expensive, and somehow empty, despite its careful perfection. But Charlotte no longer saw emptiness in the pristine surfaces and neutral tones. Instead, she recognized possibility, a stage waiting for the next performance, a laboratory prepared for the next experiment, a home where two exceptional children were learning to balance their need for safety with their growing understanding of love, loss, and the complex requirements of human connection. The sound of the elevator announced Alexander Blackwood's return from his day of corporate conquest, and Charlotte felt her pulse quicken with an anticipation she refused to examine too closely. She was eager to share her discoveries about his children's remarkable intelligence and sophisticated understanding of their circumstances, yet she recognized that such revelations would need to be presented with careful attention to his own psychological needs and defensive strategies. As his footsteps approached across the hardwood floors, Charlotte prepared herself for the next phase of her education in the complex dynamics of the Blackwood family. An education that promised to be far more challenging and infinitely more rewarding than anything described in her employment contract. Alexander Blackwood entered his penthouse that evening with the measured stride of someone who had learned to compartmentalize the various demands upon his attention, yet Charlotte detected something different in his bearing, a subtle tension that spoke of anticipation rather than mere fatigue. His pale grey eyes found her immediately in the perfectly restored living room, and she saw the fractional pause as he registered not only her continued presence, but also the absence of any evidence of domestic crisis. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice carrying that familiar note of careful control that Charlotte was beginning to recognize as his default response to situations he could not immediately categorize. "I trust your day has been manageable." "Quite enlightening, actually," Charlotte replied, rising from her position on the sofa with the fluid grace of someone who had found her equilibrium in previously unstable circumstances. "Your children are remarkable individuals, Mr. Blackwood, far more sophisticated in their understanding of complex situations than I had anticipated." Something shifted in Alexander's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or the carefully suppressed hope of someone who had learned not to expect positive reports regarding his children's behavior. He moved toward the windows with that restless energy Charlotte was beginning to associate with his moments of greatest uncertainty, his hands finding the familiar refuge of his suit pockets. "No incidents, then?" he asked, and Charlotte heard beneath the casual inquiry the weight of 18 months' worth of crisis management and damage control. "That depends on how one defines incidents," Charlotte replied, choosing her words with the precision of someone navigating diplomatically sensitive territory. If you mean disruptions requiring intervention or correction, then no. If you mean evidence of exceptional creativity and scientific methodology, then yes, several quite impressive ones. Alexander turned from the window with the sharp attention of someone who had detected something unexpected in familiar terrain. His gaze searched Charlotte's face with that penetrating intelligence she had noticed during their first interview, seeking signs of the diplomatic evasions he had undoubtedly learned to recognize in previous caregivers' reports. "Scientific methodology," he repeated, and Charlotte caught the note of genuine curiosity beneath his professional skepticism. "They've been conducting systematic experiments in environmental psychology," Charlotte explained, settling back onto the sofa with the comfortable certainty of someone who had found solid ground beneath her feet. "Quite sophisticated ones, actually. Their documentation of previous caregivers' responses demonstrates remarkable insight into human behavior and psychological vulnerability." The silence that followed her words seemed to expand and contract with the rhythm of conflicting emotions, and Charlotte watched as Alexander processed this reframing of his children's behavior from destructive rebellion to scientific inquiry. She could see him struggling to integrate this new perspective with his accumulated experience of crisis calls from schools, complaints from household staff, and the parade of defeated caregivers who had fled his employ. "You're suggesting that their activities serve a research purpose?" he asked finally, his tone carefully neutral despite the obvious intensity of his interest. "I'm suggesting that they serve multiple purposes," Charlotte clarified, understanding that oversimplification would be both inaccurate and counterproductive. Self-protection, certainly, environmental control, undoubtedly, but also genuine intellectual curiosity about human psychology and behavioral patterns. They're trying to understand the adults in their lives well enough to predict and manage those relationships safely. Alexander moved away from the window with the decisive motion of someone who had reached some internal conclusion, coming to rest in the chair opposite Charlotte with the fluid precision she was learning to associate with his moments of greatest focus. His pale grey eyes, so like his daughter's, yet tempered by years of corporate warfare and personal loss, studied her with renewed intensity. "Show me," he said simply, and Charlotte recognized the command structure that had built his empire while appreciating the vulnerability that underlay the request. The conversation that followed provided Charlotte with insights into Alexander Blackwood's character that extended far beyond his public reputation as a ruthless corporate strategist. As she described the children's elaborate Gothic transformation of the living room, their meticulous documentation of previous caregivers' weaknesses, and their sophisticated understanding of adult psychology, she watched him navigate between pride in their intelligence and concern about the circumstances that had necessitated such defensive expertise. "They documented 23 different caregivers?" he asked, and Charlotte heard the careful control that masked what she suspected was profound guilt about the instability his children had experienced. 23 systematic studies in adult behavioral patterns, Charlotte corrected gently. Each one designed to test specific hypotheses about authority, competence, emotional manipulation, and psychological resilience. "Your children have essentially earned advanced degrees in human psychology through direct observation and experimentation." "At 8 years old," Alexander said, and Charlotte caught the complex mixture of admiration and sorrow that colored his words. "Exceptional circumstances require exceptional adaptations," she replied, recognizing that this conversation was as much about his own processing of his children's experiences as about their current needs. "They've developed skills that most people never acquire because most people never face situations that demand such sophistication in reading and managing adult behavior." Alexander leaned forward in his chair with the focused attention of someone who had recognized crucial intelligence about a previously intractable problem. "What do they need, Miss Hayes? Not what the child development experts recommend or what the school counselors suggest. or what conventional wisdom dictates. What do Sophia and Sebastian actually need? The directness of the question caught Charlotte momentarily off guard, not because she lacked an answer, but because she had not expected such immediate willingness to abandon conventional approaches in favor of his children's actual circumstances. This was the same strategic thinking that had built his corporate empire, now turned toward the more complex challenge of understanding and supporting two remarkable children whose needs defied standard categories. They need to be seen and appreciated for who they actually are, rather than who adults think they should be, Charlotte replied, settling into the comfortable certainty of someone who had found the truth at the center of a complex situation. They need their intelligence respected rather than managed, their defensive strategies understood rather than dismantled, and their autonomy supported rather than constrained. And emotionally, Alexander pressed, and Charlotte heard beneath the question the desperate love of a father who feared he was failing his children despite his best intentions. Emotionally, they need to trust that the adults in their lives are competent enough to handle their complexity without being frightened or offended by it, she said quietly. They need to know that their safety doesn't depend on maintaining perfect control over every variable in their environment, because the people who care for them are strong enough to be trusted with their vulnerability. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge across previously unbridgeable territory, and Charlotte saw something shift in Alexander's expression. Recognition, perhaps, of truths he had suspected but had not known how to articulate or address. His pale grey eyes, which had been focused on her face with that penetrating intensity, now moved toward the direction of his children's rooms with something that looked suspiciously like wonder. "They told you all of this?" he asked, and Charlotte heard the careful hope beneath the apparent skepticism. "They showed me their research, shared their observations, and explained their reasoning," Charlotte replied. "But more importantly, they allowed me to understand their perspective on the situation. They're not trying to be difficult, Mr. Blackwood. They're trying to be safe while maintaining their intellectual integrity and emotional autonomy." And what about trust?" Alexander asked quietly, his voice carrying a weight of significance that suggested this question lay at the heart of his concerns. "How do I help them learn to trust when their experience has taught them that adults inevitably disappoint or abandon the children they're supposed to protect?" Charlotte felt her chest tighten with recognition as she heard the pain beneath his carefully controlled words. Here was the central tragedy of the Blackwood family, a father whose love was beyond question, but whose grief and guilt had created barriers to the very connection his children desperately needed. And two brilliant children whose defensive strategies were so sophisticated they had inadvertently isolated themselves from the emotional support they craved. "Trust can't be taught, Mr. Blackwood," she said gently. "It can only be earned through consistent demonstration of reliability, competence, and respect for their autonomy. They need evidence that the adults in their lives are strong enough to remain present and engaged, even when faced with their complexity and their defensive strategies." "Evidence," Alexander repeated, and Charlotte could see his strategic mind processing this reframing of the challenge from emotional abstraction to concrete demonstration. "They've learned to test adult commitment and competence through systematic challenge," Charlotte explained. "Not because they enjoy conflict, but because they need to know whether the people who claim to care for them possess the strength and dedication necessary for genuine relationship. Their elaborate schemes aren't attacks, they're auditions." Because the understanding that spread across Alexander's features was almost painful to witness, and Charlotte saw him grappling with the implications of this perspective for his own relationship with his children. She could see him recognizing that his attempts to protect them from challenge and complexity had inadvertently suggested weakness rather than love, while their increasingly sophisticated defensive strategies had been desperate attempts to find adults worthy of their trust. "What would you recommend?" he asked, and Charlotte heard in his voice the humble willingness of someone who had recognized that his previous approaches, however well-intentioned, had been insufficient to the task at hand. "Engagement rather than protection," Charlotte replied, understanding that her answer would require him to abandon many of his fundamental assumptions about appropriate parental behavior. "Appreciation rather than correction, participation rather than supervision. Your children don't need to be shielded from complexity. They need adult partners who can match their sophistication and provide the emotional stability that allows genuine vulnerability." "Partners," Alexander said, testing the word as though it represented foreign territory. "Intellectual equals who happen to have more experience with certain aspects of life," Charlotte clarified. "They've already demonstrated that they possess wisdom and insight that exceed their chronological age. What they lack is not intelligence or maturity, but the security that comes from knowing that their complexity is valued rather than feared by the adults who claim to love them." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of footsteps in the corridor announced the children's approach toward the main living area. Charlotte watched Alexander's posture shift as he prepared to greet his son and daughter, and she could see him attempting to integrate their new understanding into his familiar patterns of interaction. Sophia appeared first, having changed from her school uniform into casual clothes that somehow managed to maintain an air of sophisticated elegance. Her silvery blonde hair fell in perfect waves around her face, and her pale grey eyes, so like her father's, assessed the scene before her with that familiar intelligence that missed nothing and judged everything according to criteria known only to herself. Sebastian followed close behind, his dark hair still bearing traces of the afternoon's artistic endeavors, his movements carrying that casual confidence Charlotte was beginning to associate with his approach to any new situation. His darker eyes moved between his father and Charlotte with the focused attention of someone trying to read complex emotional dynamics while preparing for any necessary defensive strategies. "Father," Sophia said, her tone carrying that careful neutrality Charlotte had learned to recognize as the children's default approach to adult authority figures. "How was your day?" "Productive," Alexander replied, and Charlotte noticed how his voice had shifted, still controlled, but somehow warmer than his usual professional tone. "Miss Hayes has been telling me about your research projects. I'm quite impressed by the scope and sophistication of your work." The silence that followed his words was charged with surprise and cautious hope in equal measure, and Charlotte watched as both children processed this unexpected response to their activities. Previous conversations about their elaborate schemes had undoubtedly focused on discipline, consequences, and attempts to redirect their behavior toward more conventional channels. "She showed you our documentation?" Sebastian asked, his tone carefully neutral despite the obvious intensity of his interest in his father's reaction. "She described your methodology," Alexander replied, settling back in his chair with what Charlotte recognized as a deliberate attempt to appear relaxed and approachable. "Environmental psychology is a fascinating field. Your approach to systematic observation and hypothesis testing demonstrates remarkable scientific thinking." Charlotte felt something warm unfurl in her chest as she watched the first tentative signs of genuine communication beginning to emerge between Alexander and his children. This was not the artificial conversation of adult authority attempting to manage childhood behavior, but the careful exploration of shared intellectual territory by individuals who were beginning to recognize each other's competence and value. "We weren't trying to cause problems," Sophia said quietly, her usual poise flickering to reveal something that looked suspiciously like vulnerability. "We were trying to understand how adults think and react so we could predict their behavior and respond appropriately." "I know," Alexander said, and Charlotte heard the gentle certainty in his voice that suggested genuine understanding rather than mere parental placation. "And your research has clearly produced valuable insights. Miss Hayes has helped me understand that your activities serve important purposes that I had failed to recognize." Sebastian moved closer to his father's chair with the cautious motion of someone approaching potentially dangerous territory, his dark eyes searching Alexander's face for signs of the familiar disappointment or frustration that had characterized their previous interactions about his behavioral choices. "Are you angry about the living room?" he asked, and Charlotte heard beneath the question years of accumulated anxiety about adult reactions to their creative endeavors. "No," Alexander replied, his voice carrying a conviction that seemed to surprise even him. "I'm impressed by your planning and execution, curious about your methodology, and somewhat ashamed that I failed to recognize the intelligence behind your activities." The transformation in both children's postures was subtle but unmistakable. Shoulders that had been held rigid with defensive tension began to relax, and the carefully guarded expressions that had become their default masks for adult interaction began to soften into something approaching genuine engagement. "We have lots of other projects," Sophia offered tentatively, as though testing the waters of this new dynamic between them. "Not all of them involve redecorating." "I'd like to hear about them," Alexander said, and Charlotte recognized the authentic curiosity in his voice. "All of them. I realize I've been so focused on managing your activities that I've failed to appreciate the creativity and intelligence behind them." What followed was the most genuine family conversation Charlotte had witnessed since her arrival in the Blackwood household. The children, initially cautious but increasingly animated, began to describe their various projects and experiments, not as confessions of misbehavior requiring adult forgiveness, but as presentations of legitimate research deserving serious consideration and discussion. They spoke of their investigation into the psychological effects of environmental modification, their studies of adult authority responses under stress, their experiments in social dynamics among their peer groups at school, and their ongoing research into the correlation between expressed concern and actual reliability in the adults responsible for their care. Alexander listened with the focused attention he typically reserved for crucial business negotiations, asking questions that demonstrated genuine interest rather than interrogatory suspicion, offering observations that revealed his growing appreciation for their sophisticated understanding of human psychology and behavioral patterns. Charlotte found herself relegated to the role of interested observer as the conversation developed its own momentum, father and children discovering common ground in their shared appreciation for strategic thinking, systematic analysis, and the challenge of understanding and predicting human behavior. The intellectual connection that had always existed between them, but had been obscured by conventional expectations and mutual frustration, began to emerge as a foundation for genuine relationship. "The documentation you showed Miss Hayes," Alexander said eventually, his tone carrying the careful interest of someone approaching sensitive territory. "Did it help you understand why the other caregivers found your experiments challenging?" "Most adults don't like to be studied," Sebastian replied, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious scientific principle. "They become uncomfortable when they realize their reactions are being observed and analyzed. It makes them feel vulnerable and defensive. But understanding how people react helps us predict their behavior and respond appropriately," Sophia added, her pale grey eyes meeting her father's with that unsettling directness that suggested she was capable of seeing through any pretense or evasion. "Knowledge provides a form of safety." Yes," Alexander agreed quietly, and Charlotte heard in that simple word a recognition that his children's defensive strategies, however sophisticated, had been born from the same human need for security and predictability that drove his own approach to managing complex business relationships. It does. The evening that followed provided Charlotte with a glimpse of what the Blackwood family might become when freed from the constraints of conventional expectations and mutual misunderstanding. Dinner conversation ranged from discussions of advanced psychological theory to debates about the ethical implications of social manipulation, with all three family members contributing insights that demonstrated not only their individual intelligence, but also their growing appreciation for each other's perspectives and capabilities. Charlotte watched as Alexander discovered that his children's sophisticated understanding of human behavior could serve as a valuable resource for navigating complex social and professional situations, while Sophia and Sebastian began to recognize that their father's strategic thinking and business acumen provided a framework for channeling their analytical skills toward constructive rather than merely defensive purposes. As the children eventually retreated to their respective rooms to complete homework assignments and prepare for the following day's school activities, Alexander remained in the main living area with Charlotte, his expression thoughtful and somewhat overwhelmed by the evening's revelations. "They're remarkable," he said quietly, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and something that might have been regret. "I've been so focused on trying to give them normal childhoods that I failed to appreciate the extraordinary individuals they've already become." "They are extraordinary," Charlotte agreed, settling into the comfortable certainty of someone who had found solid ground beneath previously shifting circumstances. "But they're also children who need to know that their complexity is valued rather than feared by the adults who love them." "How do I repair the damage I've done?" Alexander asked, and Charlotte heard beneath the question the vulnerable uncertainty of a man who had conquered every professional challenge yet felt helpless before the needs of his own children. "You don't repair damage," Charlotte replied gently. "You build new patterns of relationship based on understanding and appreciation rather than correction and control. You've already begun that process tonight." Alexander moved to the windows that commanded the city like a conquered territory, but his posture suggested contemplation rather than dominance. The lights of the urban landscape spread below them like a constellation of possibilities, and Charlotte found herself thinking about the complex interplay of love, loss, and the desperate human need for connection that had brought them all to this moment. "What happens next?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had recognized that fundamental changes would be required in every aspect of his approach to parenting and family relationships. "Next, you continue to engage with them as the intelligent individuals they are," Charlotte replied, rising to stand beside him at the window. "You participate in their interests, appreciate their insights, and provide the emotional stability that allows them to risk vulnerability without sacrificing the autonomy they've fought so hard to maintain." "And you?" Alexander asked, turning to meet her gaze with those pale gray eyes that seemed to see through surface presentations to the truth beneath. "Will you stay to help us navigate this transition?" Charlotte felt something shift inside her chest as she recognized the question beneath his question, not merely about professional employment, but about her willingness to remain present and engaged during the challenging work of rebuilding family relationships based on mutual respect and understanding, rather than conventional authority structures. "If you want me to stay," she replied, understanding that her answer carried implications that extended far beyond the boundaries of any employment contract. "I do," Alexander said quietly, and Charlotte heard in those simple words not merely the response of an employer to a competent employee, but something deeper and more complex: recognition, gratitude, and perhaps the beginning of something that neither of them was yet prepared to name or examine too closely. As Charlotte made her way to her own quarters that evening, she found herself reflecting on the unexpected developments of her brief time in the Blackwood household. She had arrived expecting to manage difficult children and navigate the complicated dynamics of wealth and privilege. Instead, she had discovered a family bound together by profound love, yet separated by misunderstanding and the defensive strategies they had developed to protect themselves from further disappointment. The children's bedroom doors were closed, but soft light seeping beneath them suggested they were engaged in the quiet activities that marked the transition from day to night. Sebastian probably organizing his research materials and planning future experiments. Sophia likely reading one of the advanced texts that fed her voracious intellectual appetite. They were remarkable individuals who had been shaped by circumstances that would have defeated lesser spirits, yet who had somehow maintained their capacity for curiosity, creativity, and the deep human need for connection, despite their sophisticated defensive strategies. They had tested her, not out of malice or destructive impulse, but from the desperate necessity of determining whether she possessed the strength and reliability necessary for genuine relationship. And Alexander, brilliant, successful, yet profoundly vulnerable when it came to the children who represented both his greatest love and his most painful reminder of loss. He had spent 3 years attempting to protect them from the very experiences that had forged their exceptional strength, not recognizing that his attempts at normalization had inadvertently suggested that their actual selves were somehow inadequate or unacceptable. Tonight had marked the beginning of a different kind of family dynamic, one based on mutual recognition of intelligence and capability rather than traditional hierarchies of adult authority and childhood compliance. It would not be easy. Years of defensive patterns could not be dismantled overnight, and the complex work of building genuine trust would require consistent demonstration of reliability, competence, and respect for individual autonomy. But as Charlotte prepared for sleep in her elegant guest quarters, surrounded by the quiet luxury of her new environment, she found herself looking forward to the challenges ahead with something approaching anticipation. For the first time in longer than she cared to remember, she had found herself exactly where she belonged, not as a temporary solution to someone else's problems, but as a crucial participant in the complex work of helping extraordinary individuals discover that their complexity could be a source of connection rather than isolation. The city lights twinkled beyond her windows like a constellation of possibilities, and Charlotte fell asleep to the quiet sounds of a family learning to trust not only each other, but also the remarkable woman who had done the unthinkable. She had seen them clearly, appreciated their sophistication, and chosen to stay not despite their complexity, but because of it. In the months that followed, the Blackwood penthouse would be transformed, not through renovation or redecoration, but through the gradual emergence of genuine relationship between individuals who had finally found the courage to be seen and appreciated for who they actually were. And Charlotte Hayes, who had arrived as a temporary solution to an intractable problem, would discover that sometimes the most profound transformations begin not with grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but with the simple act of recognizing extraordinary individuals for the remarkable people they have always been, and choosing to love them not despite their complexity,